Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. Thought I'd talk a little bit about this Federal Reserve announcement that they're going to try and expedite the tapering of the bond purchases. So if you're not quite familiar with the quantitative easing, which if you're following this channel, I don't know how you wouldn't be, but if you're not familiar with the quantitative easing, this is where the Federal Reserve pretty much prints up money and buys U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Now, this is the way they've made the economy more accommodative, is kind of the term that they use. Basically, they keep interest rates low so that people can take out loans and make those payments easier. So this is the Federal Reserve's way of supporting households and businesses, is to keep interest rates low and to get people to borrow money. I still have a hard time understanding how it is that that's supporting households and businesses, but apparently that's how the Federal Reserve does it. Now, one of the things that the Federal Reserve has an issue with right now is that interest rates are so low that the monetary policy has really lost its effectiveness. So if you can imagine, like, when a recession would kick in, the Federal Reserve would typically drop the interest rates around 5%. Now, this is the Fed funds rate that they're talking about. And the Fed funds rate is really more of a target rate than it is an actual, like, set in stone kind of rate. It's more as like they kind of wrote a number on the wall and said, hey, boys, this is what we're shooting for. The big banks, when they do inter-lending to each other, like overnight lending and basically balancing out their balance sheets, this is a really easy explanation of it. The lending interest rate that they go for is that Fed funds rate. That's what they're shooting for. Now, the Federal Reserve will adjust the balance sheets of these big banks to try and make it so that the Fed funds rate, or the effective funds rate, which is what the interest rate that they actually lend to each other is, they try to make that more into that target rate, that Fed funds rate. Now, right now, the Fed funds rate is at 0. So the next time we go into recession, dropping interest rates, this isn't even a possibility. There's nothing there to drop. So really, the Federal Reserve needs to get their ammunition back. And that ammunition is the raising of interest rates. The only problem is that they raise interest rates, they would slow the economy down. They would no longer have an accommodative monetary policy. They would have a restrictive monetary policy. And coming out of this pandemic, recession, or whatever it is that we're calling this, in order to get things going, churning up interest rates right now would actually slow the economy down. Or at least this is kind of the idea behind it. Whether it actually would or wouldn't, that's another story. But that's kind of the idea behind this Fed funds rate and the raising of interest rates. Now, the Fed had no way of raising interest rates. None. Like, they tried raising them. We remember we had a taper tantrum. Then they tried going on autopilot and was only able to succeed at that for just a few months before they had to pretty much reverse course and go the other way again with it. So the moment that they start raising the interest rates is really when they start causing a bunch of turmoil inside of the markets and the economy. So even the idea of raising interest rates would kind of put the idea out there that we're going to have a slowing economy, even though the reason for raising the interest rates is to combat inflation. All right, let's talk about the inflation for just a minute. Now, before everything took place, before the pandemic, before all that stuff, if you go and you read the Federal Reserve speeches, they were more concerned about deflation coming into the future than they were about inflation. They said they had all the tools in the world to get to fight inflation, but that the deflationary scenario was much more of their concern on how to deal with that. They knew that they had a demographics problem, they knew they have a technology problem coming up, and they knew that the interest rates were so low that the return on capital was slowing the money velocity down. I mean, with these three things going on, there was like almost a guaranteed recession coming into the future. They knew that there was going to be a problem. So in the speeches, they kept saying, well, we would have to go into an average inflation rate. And I thought, okay, so what does average inflation rate mean? They said, well, we're going to take it back over a course of a certain amount of time, instead of going like, this is what inflation is and we're targeting that inflation, so if it rose above it, then you would try and drop the inflation down or raise the interest rates to slow the economy down and get the inflation back into check. But instead, they're going to take an average inflation. So it's not just what inflation is today, but the course of inflation over the past however many years that they want to go back. And putting that average together, now they're shooting for the 2% average inflation rate. So even though inflation is running extra hot for an extended period of time, what they're shooting for is that average. So it can run hot for a while, and they said they were going to let it run hot for a while to come up with this 2% average. Okay, but again, if you go back and you look at the quantitative easing program starting from 2007 and 8 and onward, I guess it was what, 8 and 9 is really when the QE started in. When you look back at those programs, none of it caused inflation. Like the Federal Reserve printed, they had $850 billion on their balance sheet by the time they were done with the quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and whatever it is that they had other programs in there with the Operation Twist and stuff. They had expanded their balance sheet from $850 billion to $4.3 trillion. $850 billion to $4.3 trillion on their balance sheet, and failed to get the inflation that they were looking for. That 2% inflation. They failed at it. So now I question, it was just like, so they're going to print up a bunch of money again, and this time we're going to get inflation? Because that's what they said they wanted to do. They said they need to get inflation to run extra hot for an extended period of time to make up for the fact that they were running low on inflation for this, the past decade or whatever. And I kept asking, how do you get the inflation? How do you get it? How do you get those price increases? Because we already had the inflation. This is another thing that, when you listen to people talk about inflation, a lot of times people will just use this blanket term, inflation, inflation, inflation. What they're talking about is retail prices, but that's not inflation. Inflation is the expansion of money and credit. So let's talk about inflation in that sense when it comes to inflation. When it comes to prices, let's talk about prices. So this is really where people misinterpret the term inflation, is that, and even in this video I was saying inflation the whole time, but really we should just be talking about price inflation, not inflation of the expansion of the money and credit, which is the true inflation. Prices are the results of that. So anyway, how did the Federal Reserve going to get the prices up when they failed to get the prices up this whole time over the last quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4? So how do they do it? I kept asking that. How are they going to do it? They severed the supply chain. Bang. You cut that thing off, and all of a sudden you cannot get the material throughout the rest of the economy like you once did. Shortages start taking place. The laws of supply and demand kick in, and if you have a huge demand, then you get prices to go up. Bang. Now they got their inflation. And now the price inflation. So this is how they were able to get it. I mean, now, a lot of people can say, well, nobody saw the pandemic come and there's no way that they could account. Okay, a lot of people are arguing differently than that. They said that they definitely saw this pandemic coming and they were definitely prepared to do this exact thing with it. So I'm not going to argue that point. All I'm arguing is that without the pandemic, they would never have been able to cut off the supply chain, never getting the inflation, price inflation, remember, okay? Never getting the price inflation up to where they wanted to be so that they could start raising the interest rates. Now they can start raising these interest rates because they have all the inflation, right? The price inflation that everybody is scared of. They finally got it. They were looking for it. Now they can raise their interest rates, get a bunch of their ammo back, and when the next recession kicks in, they can lower the interest rates again to try and stimulate the economy. Here's the thing. I don't think they're going to be able to raise the interest rates enough. Now, typically they would want to drop interest rates around 5%. I doubt they'll be able to even get a couple of percents, all right? 1 or 2% would be very unlikely in my opinion, but they definitely will start raising interest rates. Very little doubt in my mind that they will do it. How far they go, that's another question. Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that. I kind of did this video in a hurry. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.